I jolted awake at 3:47 a.m. to the sound of an ear-splitting crash. My heart hammered so violently I thought it would break through my rib cage. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew my animals, the goats, chickens, and a couple of adorable miniature horses, were in danger. Something had shattered the peaceful silence of my farm, and an overwhelming surge of dread ricocheted through me. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over my boots as I yanked them on. No time for a jacket, no time for a flashlight. I tore through the back door and bolted toward my barn, shouting at the top of my lungs to scare off whoever or whatever was there. Wind whipped across my face, the early morning chill tearing at my skin like icy claws. The distinct smell of hay mixed with the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. Each rapid heartbeat felt like a thunderclap, and I could practically feel adrenaline flooding every muscle fiber. I turned the corner and saw the barn door swaying on its hinges, one hinge broken clean off. My mind raced. This was no simple accident. No animal inside the barn could break a solid iron hinge without serious force. My stomach knotted as I wondered if a violent storm had ripped through, but the sky was eerily clear, illuminated by a pale moonlight. Then I saw it. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, right by the side entrance to the barn. It became anger in a heartbeat. Whoever had done this was no friend. I charged inside, flicking on the overhead lights. My animals were gone. My goats, usually bleating and trotting around the barn, were missing. The miniature horses, Tiny and Dolly, had vanished. The chickens, usually fussing even at night, were nowhere to be heard. It was so silent I could hear my own panicked breaths echoing off the wooden walls. I remember dropping to my knees, barely conscious of the sharp straw pricking at my skin, and letting out a guttural cry. My beloved animals, my companions, my livelihood, all gone in an instant. My mind whirled with questions. Who in their right mind would steal farm animals, and how did they manage to pull it off so quietly, aside from that final crash at the door? I staggered back onto my feet, desperate for some clue. My phone was still in my bedroom. I sprinted back to the house, yanked it off the nightstand, and dialed 911. My voice shook as I reported the theft, the fear and rage choking my words. The operator tried to reassure me, but I could hear the standard protocol tone in her voice. She'd get the county sheriff involved, and they'd send a patrol out when available. That wasn't comforting in the slightest. My farm was on the outskirts of a small town in rural Ohio, and the local sheriff's department had a lot on their plate. I slammed the phone down, trembling from the adrenaline, pacing in frantic circles in my kitchen. I couldn't just stand there. Before I could even form a plan, my mind jumped to the last big conflict I'd had with anyone, the local homeowners association, the HOA. Well, they weren't exactly local to me. My property had been around for 3 generations, predating any HOA expansions. Over the past few years, a fancy new development of cookie-cutter houses had sprung up half a mile down the road. Those uniform houses had meticulously trimmed lawns, triple-car garages, and a newly established HOA that held on to control with ironclad rules. Many longtime residents were either forced out through steep property taxes or were coaxed into selling because they didn't fit the so-called neighborhood aesthetic. I had refused to budge, refused to sign over my land or become part of any association that would tell me what color I could paint my barns or how tall my grass should be. Over the past year, I'd been pestered, letters demanding I pay fees, threats that I was violating some arbitrary regulation. But my land was outside their jurisdiction. They just hated the fact I was so close to their pristine development and yet so independent. Over the last month, the HOA's tone got more aggressive. They showed up at my door, practically banging on it. Some suited representative by the name of Mr. Hatcher had demanded I voluntarily join their association to protect my property value. I'd laughed in his face. A farm is a working property, not a pretend suburban retreat. My goats and chickens didn't exactly fit into their suburban dream world, and he made that clear. When I refused yet again, his eyes narrowed. His face twisted into this smug sneer, and he said something cryptic like, You're making a grave mistake. We take community seriously." I'd brushed it off as typical HOA intimidation. Now, I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside, ignoring the wild goosebumps forming on my arms. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. My legs felt rubbery, but I forced myself forward. This wasn't the time for fear. I had to find my animals. A million disastrous scenarios flooded my head. Had they been stuffed in a truck and driven away? Were they being hurt, sold off? It was too horrific to contemplate for long. I brushed a tear away from my cheek. I couldn't lose them. It wasn't just about livelihood. They were family. My grandfather had passed this farm on to me. He used to say, "If you take care of the land and the animals, they'll take care of you." I felt I'd already failed them. The sheriff's deputies showed up after about an hour. The sun was just beginning to tint the sky with a faint purple hue. Two officers, Johnson and Mills, stepped out of their patrol car. They took down my statement, asked me if I had any recent disputes. I told them about the HOA's relentless harassment, the repeated threats about community standards. They exchanged skeptical glances, as if it all sounded too petty for such a huge crime. They asked for any proof, like letters or emails. I had a stack of them, which they dutifully collected for evidence. Then they scoured the barn. Apart from footprints, tire tracks, and the broken hinge, there wasn't much to go on. I felt helpless, and judging by the quiet frustration on their faces, they did too. They promised to keep an eye out and check the local livestock auctions. Sometimes stolen animals wind up in shady roadside sales. The officers told me they'd file a report, but I could see that the chance of finding them quickly, or at all, was slim. Before leaving, Officer Mills told me, "I know you're upset, but there's no direct evidence that your HOA folks had anything to do with it. We'll investigate, but keep an open mind, okay?" I nodded numbly, wanting to scream that I was sure they were involved. My gut told me something was off, and I couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Hatcher's threat. As the patrol car disappeared down the dusty road, I realized that if I wanted my animals back, I might have to figure out how on my own. In the following days, I barely slept. My mind was stuck on replay, going over every detail I could remember about that night. I tried to talk to neighbors, though the nearest farm was a good 3 miles away. Nobody had seen or heard a thing. I tried setting up a meeting with the HOA to see if they knew anything or if they had any suspicious activity on their community watch cameras, but the receptionist slammed the phone down on me twice. When I finally did get a hold of someone who was presumably on the board, they refused to reveal any camera footage. They said something nonsensical like, "We only share footage for official HOA business." That felt like a giant red flag. If there was any doubt in my mind that they were behind this, it was evaporating fast. I had no choice but to dig into matters personally. I'd call it vigilante detective work if I were trying to be dramatic, but in reality I was just desperate. Every morning I'd drive around the winding roads near the new development, scanning the horizon for a glimpse of my animals. I printed out flyers with photos of my goats, chickens, and horses, posting them on the windows of feed stores and gas stations, pleading with anyone who saw them to give me a call. Days turned into a sleepless week, and each day without answers gnawed at me like 1,000 tiny needles. Then, out of the blue, I received a letter. Not in the mail, but pinned to my front door with a single piece of clear tape. My heart lurched when I saw it. Plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with bold typed letters, "Join the HOA or watch your livelihood disappear." It wasn't signed. The language was beyond cryptic. It was an outright threat. Fury exploded in my chest. The nerve of these people. I drove straight to the sheriff's station, waving the letter in Officer Mills's face, demanding they do something. He seemed startled but still cautious. They took the letter as evidence, stating they'd add it to my file. But direct evidence linking it to the HOA board was still missing. It was typed, no prints, no cameras around my house. I felt like I was banging my head against a brick wall. I decided to fight fire with fire. If they wanted me in their association so badly, maybe I'd pretend to consider it. At the very least, it'd buy me a way in. So I called the HOA office and asked to speak with Mr. Hatcher. The phone was passed around a bit, but eventually I heard that familiar, arrogant voice. I played my role, stammering about how frightened I was, and maybe I'd been too quick to dismiss their offer to join. He sounded suspiciously delighted, even asked me to come to the next board meeting to discuss membership conditions. My stomach turned at the phrase, but I forced a friendly tone and agreed. The meeting was set for a Wednesday evening at their brand new community center. I arrived to see rows of fresh paint, manicured lawns, and perfectly lined sidewalks. It was surreal, almost like stepping into a real-life model home exhibit. My battered old pickup truck stuck out like a sore thumb among the shiny SUVs and spotless sedans. I felt every pair of eyes on me as I walked into their glass-walled conference room. It was a small gathering at first, maybe a dozen people milling around, sipping coffee from disposable cups. Then Mr. Hatcher spotted me and gestured for me to take a seat. He wasted no time diving into the benefits of the HOA. He rattled off a list of services, community standards, how they keep property values high, blah, blah, blah. I nodded politely, letting him drone on, biding my time. Finally, I said, "I'd consider joining if you can guarantee my farm animals won't be an issue." His mouth twitched, eyes narrowing for just a fraction of a second. "Our regulations don't allow non-domestic animals," he said flatly, "but certain exceptions can be granted. If you're a member, we can negotiate." That word, negotiate, made me nearly grind my teeth. I knew exactly what that meant. Jump through their hoops, abide by their arbitrary rules, and maybe get a little leeway. Steeling myself, I gave him a wry grin. "I'll do whatever it takes," I lied, "as long as you can ensure no more trouble for me or my farm." The more I played the role of the anxious, beaten-down farmer, the more his mask of professionalism slipped. I saw triumph in his eyes, a smugness. He practically licked his lips at the thought of reeling me in. And that's when I realized this had to be a collective effort, not just him. The entire board must have known about the threats, maybe even orchestrated them. They needed me broken and desperate so I'd comply. But deep down, I felt a fierce determination. They'd messed with the wrong person. Over the next couple of weeks, I kept up the act. I attended smaller HOA gatherings, introduced myself to a few members, tried to blend in just enough without giving too much away. It was nauseating to listen to them complain about my eyesore property, or how the chickens were so noisy whenever they drove past. If they only knew how gentle my animals were, how they were part of a long-standing tradition on my land. I overheard whispered conversations about teaching lessons to stubborn folks who refused to sign up. It was all so cryptic. But my suspicion only grew. In the meantime, I hired a private investigator named Carla. She was recommended by a friend of mine who'd had some property stolen last year. Carla was sharp, used to be in law enforcement, and had a knack for digging up hidden dirt. She suggested we search for any unusual deliveries or clandestine shipments around the HOA community. If they'd stolen livestock, they'd have to store or move them somewhere, and if there was any sort of official involvement or hush-hush deal, she'd find a paper trail. She set to work scouring property records, local shipping manifests, and even covertly filming some of the development's less trafficked areas. One night as I was lying in bed, the phone buzzed. It was Carla. She spoke fast, excitement crackling in her voice. "I found something, a large outbuilding on a piece of land supposedly owned by the HOA. Not on their official community map, though. A caretaker's property, maybe? You should see this." My heart pounded. We agreed to meet at dawn. My mind went wild with possibilities. Could my animals be locked in some hidden structure? I barely slept. As the first rays of sunlight washed over my dusty windows, I pulled on my boots and hopped into my truck. Carla was waiting at a small cafe parking lot near the development. She had photos, grainy shots of a large barn-like building set about a quarter-mile behind a row of tall pine trees. It was fenced off, had no visible signage, and wasn't on any official blueprint she could find. The moment I saw it, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. It was the first concrete lead we'd had. We decided to do some reconnaissance at dawn the next day. Armed with binoculars and the silent prayers that we wouldn't get caught, we parked off a dirt road a short distance from the property. Through the trees, we could see a barbed wire fence surrounding the structure. There was a narrow dirt lane leading up to a padlocked gate. Sure enough, it looked more like a barn than a storage shed, a big weathered building as if it had been there for decades, almost too large to be some casual add-on for the new development. We waited and waited. Hours passed. Finally, near midday, a black SUV rolled up. A man in a collared shirt stepped out, unlocked the gate, and pulled inside. 10 minutes later, he drove out. We couldn't see what happened inside the barn, but the secrecy was unnerving. That evening, I confronted Mr. Hatcher during a scheduled meeting, feigning casual curiosity about the caretaker's barn. I asked if the HOA had any extra storage or common facilities in the area. He gave me a blank stare, then forced a smile. "We do not," he lied. My skin prickled. The next day, I tried bringing it up with some other board members. They clammed up instantly, looked around nervously, and changed the subject to the community's new tennis courts. It was obvious this outbuilding was a well-kept secret. If that was where my animals were, I had to see for myself. Carla and I decided to get closer under the cover of night. We drove out near midnight, parking on the shoulder of a side road. The moon was bright enough to see silhouettes through the pine trees, but not so bright we'd be easily spotted. We trekked through tall grass, brambles scratching our arms, minds racing with the risk of getting arrested for trespassing. The barbed wire glinted in the faint moonlight. My pulse thundered in my ears. If someone caught us snooping, the consequences could be dire. But I couldn't let fear stop me. My animals could be in there, alone and terrified. We crouched by the fence, shining a tiny flashlight at the padlock. Carla produced a small set of lock-picking tools. She'd learned them back in her law enforcement days for training exercises. It took a few tries, but the lock popped open with a quiet click. I swallowed a lump in my throat and gently opened the gate, careful not to let it creak too loudly. My breathing felt ragged. I clutched the flashlight, its narrow beam revealing a dirt path leading up to the barn door. We tiptoed forward, hearts pounding. We pressed our ears to the barn's side, straining to hear anything. My entire body went still. There it was. A faint rustling, like hooves scraping against wood, and a soft whinny. Tears threatened to spill from my eyes. Tiny and Dolly, my miniature horses. I knew their sounds anywhere. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, followed by a red-hot anger. My animals were indeed here. Steeling myself, I reached for the barn door. It was latched but not locked. Slowly I slid it open, praying it wouldn't squeak. When the gap was large enough to slip through, I shone the flashlight inside. The sight nearly tore my heart out. My goats were huddled together in a makeshift pen, looking filthy and underfed. Dolly and Tiny were next to them, tethered to a post. Their eyes were wide with fear, but when my flashlight passed over them, Dolly let out a soft neigh of recognition. The chickens were penned in a corner, a few missing feathers, looking stressed beyond measure. Rage erupted inside me. I moved forward quietly, worried about who might be around. Carla followed, camera phone in hand, taking pictures and video. The entire barn smelled of neglect, urine, manure, and stale air. My poor animals needed water, food, and proper care, and it was obvious they hadn't been receiving it. Then a sudden noise from outside froze us in place, the crunch of tires on gravel. A single beam of light slid across the barn's interior as a vehicle pulled up. Carla and I ducked behind some stacked hay bales, hearts drumming like a marching band. A door slammed, heavy footsteps approached. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing. A voice drifted in from the darkness, a man speaking into a phone. "Yeah, I'm doing a quick check on them. The board wants them healthy enough for leverage. Don't worry about it, I have it under control." Leverage. My blood boiled. They were using my animals as hostages, basically. The footsteps drew closer until the silhouette of a tall man stood in the doorway. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I recognized that smug posture. Mr. Hatcher. I felt Carla's hand grip my arm, her signal for me not to move. Hatcher flipped a switch, and a dim overhead light flickered on, illuminating my stolen animals. He walked over to Dolly, gave her a cursory glance, then tossed a couple flakes of hay into a trough. He did the same for the goats, grumbling under his breath about how he hated the smell. My fury was almost uncontrollable, but Carla squeezed my arm harder, silently pleading for patience. We needed more than just a confrontation in the dark. We needed him on record, or we'd have no legal ground to stand on. As Hatcher moved around, he talked on his phone, complaining that I was taking too long to cave in, and how they needed a final push. That was all the confirmation we needed. Carla was recording the entire conversation. I felt a rush of vindication. We catch him red-handed, admitting the board's involvement. I watched him toss a little water into a bucket, barely enough for them, then start walking back out the door. He flipped the overhead light off, returning the barn to darkness. A moment later, the outside door creaked shut. We heard the car engine start, the crunch of gravel receding. Then, silence. Carla and I exhaled collectively, as if we'd been holding our breath for an eternity. "We got him," she whispered, gripping her phone. "Let's get your animals out of here and then call the sheriff with real evidence." But we had to be smart about it. If we just took the animals right now, we might lose the chance to expose the entire HOA board. They could claim we fabricated everything, or that we trespassed on private property. We needed official backup. We needed a raid, or at the very least a well-documented rescue operation, so they couldn't spin it against me. We slipped out of the barn, relatching the door behind us, leaving the padlock open so we could return with law enforcement. My animals were still inside, but now we had actual proof. On the drive back, Carla sent the footage to her secure cloud storage. By morning, we were at the sheriff's office, shoving the phone in Officer Mills' face, practically shouting that we had the evidence they needed. Mills watched the footage, eyes widening. The audio captured Hatcher's incriminating words, including references to the board. He immediately called his superior, and within an hour, a small squad of deputies assembled. This time, they had probable cause to investigate the property for stolen livestock. I rode with them in a patrol car, my heart thudding in anticipation. We arrived at the compound in broad daylight. A few board security guards from the HOA tried to stop the sheriff from entering, but the warrant in his hand silenced them. The gates were flung open. We rushed to the barn. My heart soared at the thought of reuniting with my animals. The second we flung the barn doors wide, I spotted Dolly's face. She neighed softly, tears welling up in my eyes as I hurried to pet her muzzle. The deputies spread out, documenting everything, snapping photos, collecting evidence. Hatcher showed up halfway through the search, his face twisted in an almost comical expression of rage and panic. "You have no right," he bellowed at the sheriff. "This is private property." Mills flashed the warrant under his nose. "We have every right, sir, and we have your voice recorded stating these animals were taken for leverage." Hatcher's face turned beet red. He sputtered, tried to deny it, but the sheriff wasn't having it. Another deputy emerged from an office area in the barn, holding a file marked Membership Leverage, which included photos of my farm and typed notes about ways to encourage compliance. It was the smoking gun. In short order, Hatcher was placed in handcuffs, ranting about how this was all a misunderstanding, that the HOA was just trying to maintain standards. A handful of other board members arrived, looking equally desperate. The scene was chaotic. Deputies escorting them around, reading them their rights, all while I and a county veterinarian examined my animals on site. By midday, the local news crews had arrived, capturing the scandal. It turned out I wasn't the only victim. The HOA had intimidated or coerced a few other small property owners, though none on such a massive scale. This was the first time they'd escalated to outright theft. I loaded my weary goats and horses into a trailer, gently coaxing them in with soft words and a promise I'd never let anything like this happen again. The chickens were packed into crates, restless but alive. Relief coursed through my body when I finally closed the trailer door. That gut-wrenching fear of never seeing them again had haunted me, but now they were safe. The veterinarian gave them a quick check, confirming they were dehydrated and stressed, but otherwise okay. Tears of gratitude blurred my vision. As the chaos died down, I noticed a small crowd of local reporters forming around me. Microphones were shoved in my face. They wanted to know how this could happen, why the HOA had such a vendetta against me, and whether I'd press charges. My emotions were all over the place: anger, relief, a dizzying sense of triumph. I held Dolly's reins in one hand, stroking her neck, and mustered the words to answer. All I ever wanted was to live on my family farm in peace. They tried to steal my animals to force me into joining their association. People need to understand that real community isn't built on intimidation or violence. It's about helping each other. The cameras flashed, and I felt the weight of my ordeal reflected in their expressions. Over the next few weeks, the legal wheels turned quickly. With Carla's footage, the stolen animals, and the documents found on site, it was an open and shut case. Hatcher was charged with theft, conspiracy, and a laundry list of other violations. Several board members were indicted for their roles in the kidnapping of my livestock. The entire HOA faced a massive civil lawsuit, not just from me, but from other residents they had strong-armed. Though I knew legal battles can drag on for years, the immediate sense of justice was enough to put my soul at ease. I'd forced them to face the consequences of their actions, and that was a victory in itself. Life at the farm slowly returned to normal, though normal felt different now. I installed better security cameras, new locks on the barn, and motion sensor lights around the property. The sight of Dolly and Tiny playing in the pasture nearly brought tears to my eyes every morning. I'd walk out to collect eggs from my chickens, and for a moment, I'd just stand in the barn, inhaling that comforting scent of hay and feed, grateful that everything was back where it belonged. My grandfather had always said the farm was a place for healing and growth. I finally understood the depth of that truth. The sheriff's office continued investigating, uncovering all sorts of unethical practices tied to the HOA. I kept in touch with Carla, who became a good friend. She said I should consider activism, maybe championing the rights of rural property owners who get pushed around by big associations. I laughed at first, but the idea grew on me. My experience taught me that too many people feel powerless when facing large, intimidating organizations. Maybe my story could encourage them to stand their ground. One afternoon, as I was mending a fence with the sun beating down on my back, a car rolled up the driveway. It was Officer Mills. He walked over wearing a faint smile. "I just wanted to let you know the board members took a plea deal," he said, shading his eyes from the sun. "They admitted guilt in exchange for reduced sentences. You'll be getting restitution for the damages." I leaned on the fence post, letting out a slow breath. "I'm glad to hear it," I said. "They finally took responsibility." Mills nodded. "They did, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry we doubted you at first." I gripped his shoulder in a brief gesture of thanks. Then he drove off, leaving me with a sense of finality. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I woke up to crowing roosters and the braying of goats, strolled through the fields with Dolly and Tiny trotting behind me, fed the chickens, and enjoyed the sweet quiet of rural life. The encroaching development still loomed down the road, but the HOA had lost much of its power. A new board was elected, mostly by the outraged residents who never wanted to be part of something so corrupt. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of a neighbor driving by, giving me a friendly wave. The tension that once suffocated the area seemed to lift. One evening, as dusk settled in a warm orange glow over the fields, I sat on the porch. Dolly grazed near the fence line while Tiny trotted happily along the perimeter, playful and free. My goats were scampering around, nibbling at grass, carefree as ever. The chickens had settled in for the night, roosting peacefully in their coop. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the big oak tree in the yard. I closed my eyes, taking in the moment, letting the gratitude fill every inch of me. We had all survived the nightmare. The farm was still mine, still the safe, nurturing place my grandfather had meant it to be. In the end, I realized something profound. Standing up for what's right can come at a steep cost, but surrendering to fear or injustice costs even more. The HOA thought they could bully me, that I was just a nobody farmer who'd cave at the first sign of trouble, but they overlooked the bond I had with my land and my animals, a bond that forged a steely resilience in me. They thought they had all the power, all the resources, but one determined individual, armed with truth and the help of good people like Carla, can bring even the mightiest bullies to their knees. Looking back on the ordeal, I see how it taught me more than just the importance of protecting one's property. It reminded me that community is supposed to be about looking out for each other. My real neighbors, the ones who cared, were the ones who gave me moral support, who passed along any lead that might help me find my animals, who believed me when the law wasn't sure what to think. That's community. It's not about a set of rules designed to stifle individual expression or love for the land. It's about compassion, empathy, and shared responsibility. That's what living in a society should mean. There's a deep philosophical truth in all of this, a lesson I hope others can take to heart. True community cannot be built on coercion or control. It thrives on mutual respect, the willingness to stand up for each other, and the courage to protect what truly matters, whether that's your family, your land, or your principles. When we stand together, no amount of intimidation can silence our resolve. And so as I watch my animals roam free under the wide American sky, I find peace in knowing that sometimes a defiant spirit and a steadfast heart can overcome even the most imposing obstacles. That's the real power of unity, honesty, and love.